You don't notice it at first. It doesn't get louder, it doesn't get closer. It changes. Small interruptions, uneven intervals, like something adjusting. The lights flicker. The air feels compressed. It isn't coming from outside. It never was. This isn't a sound. Northheaven, the hum. Can you hear it? Sarah wakes in the middle of the night, startled, listening for a strange humming sound, something distant and yet uncomfortably close. It's the early hours in Northheaven, and for a moment she lies still, trying to decide whether the sound is real or only the residue of a dream. Nothing else can be heard except a dog barking far away. Outside, the snow keeps falling without pause, muting the town and pressing it into silence. The hum does not fade. It settles, becoming constant, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but never fully disappearing, never offering a clear direction or source. Sarah closes her eyes, waiting for it to stop. It doesn't, and she realizes, with a quiet unease, that this is not the first night she has woken up like this. The sound has been there before, enough to keep her awake, enough that sleep will not return as long as it remains. Sarah realizes that no matter how hard she tries, sleep will not come. The decision is quiet but final. She gets up. As she moves through the house, the hum seems to grow louder, not suddenly, but enough for her to notice. It follows her as she walks toward the window facing the street. In the dim light, she stumbles against a few boxes from her recent move. She steps around them, steadying herself, and reaches the wall beside the window. When her hand touches it, she feels it, a faint vibration, subtle but unmistakable, as if something outside is passing through the walls, making them tremble ever so slightly. The vibration seems to move in sync with the hum, and for the first time Sarah can no longer tell whether the sound is coming from outside the house or from inside her own head. It reminds her of a machine left running somewhere far away. A motor, a vehicle, something in motion, distant and constant, always approaching and yet never arriving. From the window, Sarah sees the street exactly as it should be, empty, still. The snow falling steadily under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. No cars, no people, no movement that could explain the sound. The houses across the street sit dark and quiet, their windows reflecting nothing but the night itself. She presses closer to the glass, listening. The hum does not grow louder outside. It does not weaken either. It feels unchanged, indifferent to distance. Somewhere above the rooftops, the clouds hang low, dense enough to erase the sky. For a brief moment, Sarah has the uneasy impression that the sound is not traveling through the street at all, but coming from somewhere beyond it. She scans the sky instinctively, then stops herself. There is nothing there. No lights, no shapes, just clouds, snow and silence layered over the hum. And yet as she watches, a faint shimmer crosses the cloud cover, so subtle it could be dismissed as light bending in the falling snow. It lasts less than a second. Sarah steps back from the window. The street hasn't changed, but the feeling has. Later that day, the town feels normal again. Too normal. Cars pass, shops open. People move through their routines as if the night had left no mark behind. Sarah almost convinces herself it was nothing, just exhaustion, stress, the unfamiliar silence of a new place. It's at the grocery store that it happens. She's standing in line when the woman in front of her sighs, rubbing her temples. "Did you hear it last night?" She asks no one in particular, her voice low, almost apologetic. Sarah looks up instinctively. The woman hesitates, then adds, "That sound, the hum." No one answers right away. A man behind them shifts his weight. Another nods briefly. Someone mutters that it only happens at night. Someone else says it stopped when they left town for the weekend. The conversation never fully forms. It breaks apart before it can become anything solid. But Sarah understands something then. The sound didn't wake only her. It had settled in the town. The name reaches Sarah before the woman ever does. It's mentioned in passing, in lowered voices and half smiles that carry no humor. Someone refers to her as the blind one by the old road. Another says she's lived there longer than anyone can remember. No one speaks with hostility. What surrounds the name is something quieter than rejection, dismissal. They say she hears things, always has. That she talks about the hum as if it were more than noise, as if it were trying to say something. The comments usually end the same way. She means well, she's harmless, she doesn't see things clearly anymore. The irony isn't lost on Sarah. The woman lives alone at the edge of Northheaven, where the town thins out and the road stops pretending it goes somewhere important. People don't avoid her out of fear. They avoid her out of inconvenience. Listening would take time and patience, and the risk of hearing something that doesn't fit. Sarah doesn't seek her out right away. What lingers instead is a sentence she overhears and can't forget, that the hum isn't just sound, that it changes. That night, Sarah listens differently. She doesn't try to locate the hum. She doesn't try to measure it or explain it away. She lets it remain. And for the first time, she notices something she can't unhear once it's there. Not volume, not rhythm, but variation. Small interruptions, uneven intervals, as if the sound were folding in on itself like breath layered over breath. The next morning, Sarah goes looking for the house. The woman is blind. That much is immediately obvious. Her eyes remain unfocused, pale and still, but her head turns before Sarah speaks. She doesn't ask who's there. She simply says,
"You came because of the sound."
Inside, the house feels different. Not darker, just quieter. The windows are covered. The furniture is sparse. Nothing hums. Nothing clicks. The silence feels deliberate. The woman introduces herself, though Sarah realizes she already knows the name. She says she doesn't
I
hear
don't
the
hear
hum
the
the
hum
way
the
others
same
do.
way others do.
That
I've
she
never
never
heard it
did.
like others do.
She explains without being asked how losing her sight sharpened everything else, how sound became texture, how patterns emerged where others heard only noise. She doesn't claim to know what the hum is.
I don't know what the hum is, just what it does. It repeats, but not like a machine. It answers itself.
Sarah feels a tightening in her chest as the woman reaches for a small recorder on the table, her fingers moving with certainty. She presses play. What comes through the speaker barely resembles the hum Sarah knows. The low frequency is there, buried deep, but layered over it is something else, thin, wavering, uneven, pulses that rise and collapse, pauses that feel intentional. The woman says it's not speaking, not the way people speak, but it's not random either. Once you hear the pattern, she explains, it becomes impossible to ignore. The hum shifts depending on the time of night, on weather, on proximity. It behaves less like interference and more like exchange, like two things overlapping, one we can hear and one we can't. When Sarah asks why no one listens, the woman smiles faintly.
Listening would mean admitting the hum isn't passive and people are more comfortable with noise than with meaning.
Before Sarah leaves, the woman adds one last thing.
The sound isn't everywhere, it only feels that way.
It comes from somewhere specific. She doesn't say where. She doesn't have to. As Sarah steps back onto the road, the hum is there again, unchanged in volume, unchanged in presence. But now it carries weight, structure, intention. For the first time, Sarah understands that the sound isn't simply something happening to Northheaven. It's something addressing it. Sarah leaves the house with the uneasy certainty that something has already shifted, not around her, but in the way the town now seems to register her presence. The road is the same narrow strip of cracked asphalt, the trees unmoved, the sky heavy and low. Yet the hum feels closer than it did minutes before, no louder, no clearer, simply nearer, as if distance has become irrelevant. She tells herself she is imagining it, that prolonged attention has a way of reshaping perception, but the thought fails to settle. What stays with her instead is the woman's calm assurance, the implication that the sound does not drift aimlessly through Northheaven, but moves with purpose, intersecting the town rather than filling it. As Sarah walks, she begins to notice gaps in the sound, brief absences so subtle they might have gone unnoticed before, moments where the hum thins and then resumes with surgical precision. Each interruption feels timed, not to the environment, but to her own movement, as if the system generating the sound is adjusting its output in response to her position. She stops once, abruptly, and the hum does not cease, but it changes, flattening into something more uniform, stripped of its earlier complexity. When she starts walking again, the variations return. The realization tightens her breath. This is no longer passive background noise, it is tracking. Her decision to find the source hardens into resolve, and with it comes a sensation she cannot place, a pressure that does not touch her skin, but seems to occupy the air above her. Sarah looks up instinctively. The sky offers nothing unusual, no shape, no movement, no distortion she can confidently name, yet the feeling remains, steady and deliberate, like a tension held at a precise distance. She understands, without evidence, that whatever is there is not approaching her and has no need to. It is aligned, matching her trajectory, confirming something rather than reacting to it. The hum deepens slightly, settling into a lower register that vibrates faintly in her jaw. Her investigation begins quietly, without announcement or assistance. She starts with maps, old municipal records, infrastructure diagrams archived and forgotten, tracing lines that converge near the outskirts of town, where utilities overlap in ways that no longer make sense. A relay station appears in multiple documents under different names, officially decommissioned decades ago, its purpose absorbed into newer systems that should have rendered it inert. Yet the hum intensifies every time Sarah drives past the area, the sound acquiring a density that presses against her ears rather than passing through them. She records it from multiple distances, layering the files later, and discovering that the variations the blind woman described are not random at all. They form repeating sequences, incomplete on their own, but coherent when combined, like fragments of a larger signal unfolding over time. As she digs deeper, a pattern emerges that unsettles her more than any technical anomaly. Every person in Northheaven who reports hearing the hum shares an overlooked similarity. A history of missing time dismissed as stress, exhaustion, or childhood illness, followed by years of unexplained sensitivity to sound. Medical records mention tinnitus. Psychological evaluations mention fixation. None mention the hum itself, because no one ever thought to name it. When Sarah plays her recordings for them, the reaction is immediate and visceral. They do not ask questions. They do not debate authenticity. They recognize the sound with a familiarity that borders on grief, as if something long suppressed has been brushed awake. One man grows pale and grips the arms of his chair, insisting that the recording reminds him of a place with no walls, in the way people understand them, a place where sound behaves differently, where movement feels guided rather than chosen. A woman begins to cry without knowing why, repeating that the hum is wrong here, that it is thinner, weaker, like an echo leaking through a door that was never meant to open from this side. None of them describe abduction. None describe beings or machines. What they describe is recognition. the body responding to a structure it has known before. Late one night, reviewing the layered recordings alone, Sarah notices something she missed before. Beneath the dominant frequencies is a sub-pattern that only appears during specific intervals, brief windows where the hum stabilizes into perfect symmetry. During those moments, every environmental variable drops out of relevance. The sound does not react to wind, temperature, or distance. It holds steady as if waiting. When she compares those timestamps to historical records, her hands begin to shake. Each interval aligns with reports of brief disappearances in Northheaven, moments when people were gone for hours or days and returned unable to explain where they had been. The realization settles slowly, heavily. The hum is not a byproduct of movement. It is the mechanism that allows it. A transport system operating within a spectrum. Humans were never meant to interpret, cycling open and closed on a schedule precise enough to evade notice for decades. Northheaven is not being observed from afar. It is embedded within an operational network. Its residents intersected, removed, and returned without spectacle. The people who hear the hum are not sensitive. They are experienced. When Sarah steps outside again, the pressure in the sky is unmistakable. The presence above her holds its position, silent and patient, no longer merely observing, but acknowledging her understanding. The hum settles into a steady, resonant tone, and Sarah knows with absolute clarity that by recognizing the system for what it is, she has made herself visible to it. Before dawn, Sarah tries to leave Northheaven, driven by the need to test whether the town is the condition or merely the container. The idea that distance might restore order feels thin, even as she acts on it, but motion is the last variable she still controls. She follows the main road out, past the final cluster of houses and the long stretch where the trees give way to open land, watching the town dissolve behind her. The hum does not weaken. It does not stretch or blur with speed. It remains perfectly intact, unchanged by geography, as if the concept of away no longer applies. She drives until the fuel gauge dips lower than planned, until the road becomes unfamiliar enough to demand attention, and still the sound persists, present not in the engine, not in the tires against asphalt, but in the space she inhabits. When she finally pulls over and cuts the engine, the silence around her is complete, almost theatrical. Yet the hum continues, steady and precise, occupying the air with her. Standing alone at the roadside, she understands what the town could never have shown her. The sound was never anchored to Northheaven. Northheaven was anchored to it. Sarah turns back, not out of fear, but out of confirmation. Leaving has answered the only remaining question. By the time she crosses back into town, the hum feels compressed, refined, as though it has adjusted to a smaller operational field. Northheaven greets her with its usual restraint, the same lights, the same absence of reaction, but the neutrality now reads as compliance. The town is not unaware, it is simply not addressed. Her house is a temporary rental, sparsely furnished, chosen for convenience rather than comfort, a place meant to be occupied briefly and without attachment. That fact makes what follows worse. As she steps inside, the space does not resist her, but it does not feel empty either. Sound behaves differently here than it did hours ago. Certain rooms dampen it almost completely, while others seem to carry it longer than they should, the hum threading through walls and corners, as if mapping the interior. The effect is subtle, but unmistakable, and Sarah resists the urge to retreat back outside, knowing that thresholds no longer offer protection. As night settles, the vigilance she once sensed in the sky reconfigures. There is no descent she can observe, no movement to track, only a redistribution of presence that shifts from above to around. The hum stabilizes into a single, unwavering tone, stripped of variation, and in that steadiness Sarah recognizes completion. Whatever adjustment was required has finished. The house, never meant to be permanent, now feels claimed in a way ownership cannot describe. She sits at the edge of the bed, the unfamiliar furniture offering no comfort, and realizes that the fear rising in her chest is not panic, but something older, more absolute. It is the understanding that shelter is no longer a given, that walls and doors function only as suggestions within a system that does not acknowledge them. The hum does not press against her. It does not intrude. It simply exists, sharing the space with an indifference that feels deliberate. Sleep comes in fragments, shallow and unconvincing. When she wakes, the sound is unchanged, as present as it was hours before, as if time has passed without registering. Morning light filters through the curtains, illuminating a room that still does not feel fully hers, and Sarah understands that this is the true consequence of her investigation. She has not uncovered a secret meant to be hidden. She has crossed a threshold that reclassifies her within a system that has no language for explanation. The beings who operate the hum do not need to take her to complete the cycle. They have no urgency, no requirement for spectacle. By recognizing the system, Sarah has rendered distance unnecessary. The difference between inside and outside, between city and elsewhere, has collapsed into a single operational space. Standing alone in a house she has barely begun to inhabit, the hum steady and unyielding, Sarah understands that she is no longer waiting to be taken. The condition itself has changed. Northheaven has not trapped her. It has simply revealed that escape was never part of the design. Night settles over Northheaven with a stillness that no longer feels incidental. Sarah stands alone in the narrow hallway of the rented house, the hum now unmistakably present, fuller than it has ever been, occupying the space with a density that presses inward rather than outward. There is no confusion left in her movements, no hesitation. Whatever uncertainty once existed has already been resolved, not through answers but through recognition. She knows the system is active. She knows the presence is aware. And she knows with a clarity that leaves no room for resistance that avoidance is no longer part of the equation. She walks toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, each step accompanied by a subtle increase in the hum's intensity, not louder in volume but richer, layered as if multiple frequencies are aligning around her. The rest of the house recedes into irrelevance. Walls, doors, familiar dimensions lose their authority as organizing structures. The sound is no longer something she hears. It is something the space obeys. Sarah reaches the doorway and pauses for a brief moment, her hand resting on the frame. There is no fear in her expression now, only the restrained tension of someone standing at the edge of an irreversible act. She steps inside. The door does not close behind her. It remains slightly ajar, a deliberate allowance, as though the system has no need to hide what it is about to complete. From the hallway, a soft but unmistakable luminosity begins to spill outward from the room. Not a harsh light, not a glow meant to illuminate, but a controlled emission that pulses in perfect synchronization with the hum. Light and sound rise together, not chaotically, but with mechanical patience, each cycle tightening the sense that something is being calibrated rather than revealed. Nothing moves into view. Nothing needs to. The hum fills the auditory field completely now, erasing all other sound, while the light deepens in presence, flattening shadows and dissolving depth. The house, the hallway, the town beyond them feel reduced to a passive container for a process that no longer acknowledges human scale or perspective. Then, without warning or transition, everything stops. The hum cuts to absolute silence. The light vanishes. What remains is an empty hallway, a half-open door, and the unsettling certainty that something has concluded beyond our access. There is no confirmation of departure, no evidence of struggle, no sign of intrusion. Only the absence of sound where sound had been constant, and the absence of explanation where meaning once pressed insistently. Northheaven does not react. It never has. And somewhere within the silence left behind, the implication settles fully. The phenomenon was never about being taken. It was about being acknowledged, integrated, and allowed to cross a threshold that most never realize exists. The hum was not a warning nor a call for help. It was the sound of a system operating patiently, waiting for the moment someone would finally understand it well enough to stop listening from the outside. The hum cuts to absolute silence. The light vanishes without transition, and the hallway remains exactly as it was, still and empty, the bedroom door left slightly ajar, offering no sign of what completed itself beyond it. Thank you for watching until the end. Your presence is important to us. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This way, YouTube understands that you want to keep listening to what comes next.